So what's traded in this new global economy? It's no longer luxury goods that are manufactured in each region, moving around back and forth. The old Asian trade is still continuing, but the new trade set up with the European hegemon is one that extracts people from Africa, sends them to the Americas, and using various forms of forced labor puts them and the indigenous Americans to work extracting primary resources that are then sent to Europe. And the main primary resources that are extracted are precious metals, gold and silver, and increasingly over the course of the colonial period, sugar and cotton and a few other agricultural products. So there's an extraction of primary resources with forced labor that serves to deplete the economies of both Africa and Latin America to the advantage of Europe, and also starts to give Europe, which basically doesn't produce anything during this period, a leg up into the trade, the old trade routes with China and India. As Andre Gunder Frank put it, it was with American silver that the Europeans bought a third-class seat on the Asian train. This is the classic colonialism, and I think it's the colonialism that we all know and love, that we're sort of familiar with the contours of this 1492 until about the mid-19th century form of colonialism. A lot of things changed in the mid-19th century. A lot of terminology changed, but there were some things that remained very constant despite the major changes that took place. And I also think it's important for us to look at when changes are more superficial than deep. And some of the changes that took place in the 19th century were deep, and some of them were superficial. So some of the relationships remained the same. So what changed in the 19th century? The Americas became independent, a change that in many ways was more superficial than deep. That is, despite their political independence, most of the Americas remained in a neo-colonial kind of relationship, where the economic relationship didn't fundamentally shift. So they're still using various forms of forced labor to produce raw materials that are going to enrich Europe. The one thing that did change drastically in the Americas is northern United States emerging as a new colonial power. And the center of power also moves north in Europe. That is, from Spain and Portugal, it moves into the northern European countries. And the northern United States and northern Europe industrialize. This is a very fundamental change, and it changes the colonial system as well. The slave trade ends. This is very important, the slave trade ending, and yet the colonial position of Africa is in fact grows in the 19th century because Africa is directly colonized. So Latin America is decolonized, Africa is colonized at the same time. This is a new kind of imperialism, industrial imperialism. Some of the same old crops are extracted from Latin America and Africa, the same old metals, but some new crops and metals are also extracted during the 19th century industrial imperial era. And I should also say that the peripheries of Asia are now incorporated into the colonial system in the industrial imperial era. Britain takes over India, France and Britain are taking over Southeast Asia, the United States is going into the Pacific. What kinds of goods are needed for industrial imperialism? They're still primary resources. And we have come to associate colonialism with the extraction of primary resources, but there's new kinds of metals that are needed to fuel the industrial machinery. There's new kinds of fertilizers that are mined in Latin America and Africa to make European agriculture more productive, so that with fewer workers, European agriculture can continue to feed the new industrial labor forces. There are new products that go into industry, like rubber, cotton that's used in the textile industry, leathers, new foods that feed the industrial labor force, what are known as the tropical stimulants. That is, the new industrial labor forces, people who used to farm and produce grains and nutritious foods that they ate, eating what they produced, Their diet now changes to be based on tropical stimulants that provide little in terms of nutrition, but keep them working every day. Things like coffee, tea, sugar. Bananas are another industrial imperial crop of this time period. Industrial imperialism maintains European hegemony. It maintains this global inequality. In fact, global inequality grows dramatically during the industrial imperial period as Northern Europe and the Northern United States are industrializing. Their standard of living starts growing much more quickly away from the standard of living everywhere else in the world, based on the inputs primarily from Africa, Latin America, and the peripheries of Asia, regions that are then becoming underdeveloped. As the book by the Guyanese historian Walter Rodney, I like using book titles, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. That is, the underdevelopment of what came to be known as the Third World was a process of extraction of resources and impoverishment. It's not that they started out poor, it's that they were underdeveloped. They were impoverished through colonialism. So this industrial imperial system lasted until approximately World War II. And since World War II, we're in a new period, which sometimes we can use the term globalization as a convenient explanation for what's going on in this contemporary period. But I would say we understand this contemporary period much less well than the others because we're still living through it. In some ways, we don't even really have the vocabulary to explain how things are working in this period. But there are some things that we can point out that characterize it. Colonialism per se ends. That is, decolonization of the last remaining colonies takes place after 1945, after the end of World War II. So India becomes independent, the African countries become independent, the last colonies in Latin America, most of them become independent, not quite all of them. The African colonies become independent. So we have this world that on the face of it is made up of equal countries that compete equally in a new international system, and yet they're starting from very different places because of where colonialism has brought us all to. Despite the end of formal colonialism, neo-colonialism continues to reign in Africa, Latin America, and the peripheries of Asia. So the economic relationships established with colonialism don't change, even though the forms of direct political domination change. Other things have changed also in this post-colonial period, or the period of globalization. And one of the things, so decolonization, I think we all understand. The continued extraction of resources from these former colonies, we also still understand. But some of the things that have changed, we haven't come to terms with as much. And one of those things is deindustrialization. That is, we still use the term industrialized countries to refer to the northern United States and northern Europe, or industrialized regions, when in fact, those are no longer the industrialized regions, they're the post-industrial regions, or the deindustrializing regions. We're used to thinking of the industrialized regions as the exploiters, the most wealthy regions, the regions that are taking the resources of the rest of the world, processing them, and then trying to sell them back to the rest of the world at a great profit. But maintaining a much higher standard of living for their own citizens. But in the post-colonial period, or the globalization period, industry's moving from the first world to the third world. But it's a very different kind of industrialization in the third world than it was 100 years ago when it was happening in the first world. The capital is still coming from the first world. The profits are still going to the first world. What it's basically doing is outsourcing production to the places that have been made poor so that industry can take advantage of the impoverished workers and even systems of forced labor that were created through 4 centuries of colonialism. So the industrial labor force in the so-called industrialized countries that struggled over the course of the 18th and 19th century to gain rights, to improve their position, to gain citizenship, full political citizenship and workers' rights in their countries. Businesses don't want to have to deal with them. They want colonial labor conditions, and so they're moving industry into the former colonies to follow those colonial conditions. At the same time, the deindustrializing period is seeing large waves of migration